Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Whether you're watching a video or listening to a podcast, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. Links to videos or MP3 files can be found on MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Go to MarlenePardo.com for information on new book releases. I narrate several podcast series that can be found on major podcast platforms and can also be listened to via Alexa, Sonos, and other home systems. Look for Supernatural Storytime for scary storytelling, Nightshade Diary for classic horror and adventure stories, Stories of the Supernatural for interviews with different guests on the show. If you want to get noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird, just visit Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at MiamiGhostChronicles.com or find us on Blogspot. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good, I hope. I'm doing good. Everything is good over here. Something I forgot to remind you guys, so that's why I'm going to say it up front. Please sign up for my newsletter. Okay, I've got a newsletter that goes out on Substack, and I usually send weird articles, and there's links to any of my projects, the books, videos, any of the other series that I have that are podcast series, Nightshade Diary. I have all those links, and I send them out like once or twice a week. And also, like I said, whenever I'm, launching a new book, all that neat stuff is in there. So go and if you go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, you're going to find links there to sign up for the newsletter or for anything else, links to any of the videos, links to any of the podcasts, whether it's this show, Stories of the Supernatural, Nightshade Diary, Supernatural Storytime, or even the Eerie News, which is the latest one that I put out, which comes out about every 3 days, which is just weird stories from all over the place. The weirder, the better, right? And also, I wanted to talk about my sponsor. My sponsor is plantostaysafe.com, plantostaysafe.com. All right. And basically, they've got all these neat little gadgets. We're not talking here about, high-tech security systems. We're talking, let's say, if you're traveling and you need one of these alarms that you want to hang on the doorknob of your motel room, stuff like that, practical stuff. Same thing, that you can have at home. They have diversion safes, stuff. Let's say you've got some jewelry or a little bit of cash, you want to put it away somewhere, and they've got these little diversion safes. In other words, we're not talking a big giant $100 safes. This is stuff that basically it helps you hide your cash or just jewelry that you don't want to leave, let's say, out in the open, and it helps you put it away. And they've got a lot of neat stuff. They've even got things that you could put in the wall. In other words, they help you stay safe in a practical way, but a lot of original ideas. They've also got a lot of great self-defense products for women. So check them out, plantostaysafe.com, plantostaysafe.com. All right, here we go. And for those of you, because I know everybody was asking me about my chickens, like last week I said something had dug in under one of my pens and took two of the chickens, and one was really hurt and it died. I tried to save it. So I'm down to 2. These are blue Andalusians. All right. I'm telling you, but the other chicks that I've got with the moms, they're fine. And, that's the nature of the beast when you have farm animals or poultry, that always happens. And, what can I say? And, also, I know some of you had asked me, to take pictures of the hens with the chicks and stuff like that. I've got to I promise Scouts, even though I've never been a Scout, Scouts promise I'm going to do that. Matter of fact, what I want to do is, instead of taking pictures, I want to take some videos of all the hens. That's why I keep them. A lot of times people have asked me, oh, you've got the hens with the chicks inside a cage, even though the rest of my flock is free range and they forage all over the place. I do that specifically to guard them from exactly that, because I've got iron bars at the bottom and all around, and that's the only way to survive, especially if you live out in the sticks like I do. Okay, let's get on to the good part. And the good part is who I have as a guest tonight. This is the first time this gentleman's been here. His name is Ken Goudsward, and he is a best-selling author and independent researcher whose interests include archaeology, philology, ontography. He writes in a variety of genres, including nonfiction, science fiction, dark comedy, and poetry. His books include Magic in the Bible, UFOs in the Bible, Enuma Elish. And at the end, we'll go ahead and we'll put out his his website credit is going to be on the credits of the show, but we'll put out for the podcast listeners where you can find him on YouTube and also on his website. Help me welcome him. How are you doing today, Ken?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
No, on the contrary, it's my pleasure. I'm going to ask you, let's get that. Did you go into this field by accident? Was an experience that took you there? What happened?
Well, yeah, I guess it was sort of by accident and sort of a little bit by experience, but probably not the type of experience you might think. I grew up very heavily involved in the church. And so for the last, well, I don't know. It's hard to keep track of time nowadays. I'm getting to be 52. So, but for many years, I served at church and led worship, and I was a deacon for the last few years. And as kind of part of that was sort of like almost like sort of trying to sometimes churches get in kind of a rut, and sort of like, okay, well, what can we do here? And part of that was sort of really looking into I started noticing a big difference between Jesus's ministry and the ministry that passes for ministry in today's church, and it's very different. So studying Jesus really got me into a healing ministry, and so that was interesting because that's sort of paranormal in a way. And then from there, I became interested in the parallels between that kind of thing, the kind of things that you do in a healing ministry, and what would be typically considered magic. And so there are a lot of parallels there. And so that was what got me down the path of writing my first book, Magic in the Bible. It's not my first book, but the first book that's sort of along the kind of things are getting a little bit weird. And then from there on, I always was really a big fan of ancient aliens and the whole kind of paleo contact theories, but I never really knew what to believe about it. But it was always fascinating to me. So I decided to kind of do a deep dive and see, because you have guys like Eric von Daniken and many other authors who will basically say that there are UFOs in the Bible, but they're kind of just saying it, and they don't really do a lot of in-depth in terms of here's why they think that, right? How did they get to this conclusion? So I thought that was an interesting question, and I wanted to see if really there was any evidence in the Bible itself. And it turns out there is a ton of evidence. So I ended up writing this book, UFOs in the Bible, which is right here, and it's a good sized book, big enough to have a spine on it anyway. And through that, just really was fascinated to find out how many UFO encounters are in the Bible. It's almost not even an exaggeration to say, maybe a slight exaggeration to say that pretty much every character in the Bible is a UFO contactee.
Let me ask you, do you think, and I imagine this is something like you said, that once you go in depth and you study it, looking at it, like, is this what it is? Are we talking about people not understanding, how can I say this? Something that we could interpret as being a UFO or an extraterrestrial visitation versus something natural but just misunderstood by the people living in those times?
Right. So there is, of course, it's conceptually difficult to explain what you've seen when something strange happens to you. And that is still true to this day. Even though we have language around it, we can say, hey, I saw a UFO. But that doesn't really truly convey what it is that we saw. So people end up talking about, I saw a light, I saw lights moving, but
Right.
it's not literally a light. I mean, there's lights associated with it, but it's not simply a lamp floating through the sky. So even when we do have the language for it, it still is somewhat insufficient in a way. So take that back to people who lived in, like, not Stone Age, but pretty close to it.
Mm-hmm.
They typically, technically they'd call it usually Bronze Age. A lot of these
Bronze Age, Iron Age.
characters in the
Okay.
Bible,
All
yeah,
right.
and so they didn't have uh, the language for machines.
Mm-hmm.
They did have metal. They knew what metal was, and that is the language that you actually do see appearing in these texts. Is that they are actually talking about metal, and the metal is in the sky, and there's often fire and smoke and very loud noises, and often lights as well. So it's interesting that we actually strip down these stories almost in a way that makes it seem like these guys are more primitive than they really truly were, because we take out the metal elements when we tell these stories,
Mm-hmm.
and we tell them as if it's a supernatural being, but
Right.
that's not in the text at all. So it's the texts do not generally. I mean, there's a lot of stories, so you can't generalize all of them, but um, they generally don't sound like, hey, there was a man who had wings on his back. Like, that's not what they're talking about. But
Right.
what they do say is there was a loud, shiny object that looked metallic, and it came from the sky. So
Right. So they're not interpreting it as a supernatural event. They're just describing.
I don't believe,
Maybe
right.
they don't
So
understand how it does that, but
yeah, exactly. And there is a little bit of a supernatural element to it sometimes,
okay.
because the characters who are um, having these visitations are sort of, in some cases, already sort of leaning to that um, supernatural, I guess. But it's strange because um, they don't generally say God showed up.
Okay.
Like, and they could easily say that, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they have the language for God, and there's actually a lot of language around what the concept for God was in their mind, which we are also misinterpreting because we roll up a bunch of their different concepts into one. For example, everywhere in the Old Testament, where you read the word God, which is a lot of times because he's kind of the main character. Um, but the Hebrew word, there is no actual Hebrew word that means God in the same way that word means for us.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Hebrew, there's several different words. The one of them is Yahweh, which
Mm-hmm.
is the name of a specific God. Let's say a specific God that Moses and his followers worshipped. So you have Yahweh, and in some of these encounters, Yahweh is identified, and he sometimes does speak to the person having the encounter. However, um, that's that is, I would say, on the more rare side of it. Like, if you look at the numbers of different things that people are experiencing. It's not usually Yahweh, but he is named a couple of times. But often you'll have a character who is identified as an Elohim. Now,
Okay.
so an Elohim is a different word. It's not Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And though we generally in English and in Christianity have interpreted Elohim to mean God, but that's not what it means. It is literally a pluralistic uh, group of some type of individuals that we can assume to be living beings who are intelligent. Now, it
Okay.
doesn't necessarily tell us anything about them beyond that, but it is definitely not a singular person and not somebody who is claiming to come in ultimate godlike form or power. It's in generally not like that at all. It's usually somebody who seems to be maybe a little more than a regular human being, but also not like this the whole God concept that we think of. Um, Often Elohim is seen as or is basically the author of the story is identifying the character that he's witnessing as an Elohim. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's not even that. A lot of times it's they're actually just called a messenger,
Okay.
and many times the witness is getting some kind of message, and that whole messenger thing has kind of evolved into what we generally consider to be angels, but they're the biblical case for our view of what an angel is pretty much non-existent in the canonical Bible. Uh,
Okay.
it's talked about in the Book of Enoch and some of the other books, which are specifically have been cut from the Bible. So it's very interesting to me that even though you could even say not allowed to read the Book
Mm-hmm.
of Enoch, that we keep some of the concepts that are in there. So angels is a very, very strange phenomenon that I mean, it's a strange phenomenon in and of itself, but then the way that has kind of morphed into the sort of acceptable theology of Christianity is possibly even stranger because it's literally just been edited out and yet it's still there.
One of the things, because of course, the Old Testament and everything, we're looking at it, Hebrew, it was the Hebrew people, but at that time, of course, there were a lot of other ancient civilizations. And when you said ancient aliens, you always get the impression that extraterrestrials, in other words, all these different civilizations perhaps had contact with some extraterrestrials we don't know. Did you run across
Right.
anything where back in it would be the Old Testament, where they, like you said, they didn't recognize them per se as gods or deities? How's that?
Yeah, for
But
sure.
what was their attitude? They exist, or you have to be careful with them, or we've just observed them. In other words, we really didn't have any interaction, but we observed them, or we observed something about them.
Well, I mean, if you look at these encounters, they're literally physical encounters, and
Okay.
many times there's physical evidence left behind, which would make it a close encounter of the second kind,
Mm-hmm.
or possibly third and fourth, because there's often communication happening between them. So what we're generally not talking about is, hey, look at that weird light in the sky. Isn't that strange? It
Right.
must be something. No, it's not like that. It's far more significant than that kind of thing. And it has, it's been happening for thousands of years and it's never stopped because we still to this day have millions of people every year who are witnessing similar things. Now, if you count the hey, that's a weird light over there. Well, I've met lots of people who've seen that, and it comes across my plate, well, maybe weekly or monthly, where somebody contacts me and says, "Hey, I just saw this weird light." I'm like, "Okay, well, that's cool. I mean, it might be something, but it's hard to say anything about a weird light unless you can
Sure.
see it moving in specific ways." Um, and there are some cases in the Bible where there is basically just a weird light, and the most famous of which is in Matthew, the book of Matthew, where the three wise men uh, follow this weird light to Bethlehem.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
but that one is more than just a weird light, because it's a weird light that they're able to follow for weeks or months at a
Right.
time.
The Magi. Right. They people don't realize that
Right.
they arrived days and days and days after the birth of
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they couldn't just hop on the freeway and just follow
Yeah.
that light. It's going to take weeks, or like it's going to take a long time. They're on foot, or possibly with donkeys or camels or something.
Hmm.
Either way, it's a long journey from wherever the heck they came from, which was far away. And essentially, all the Bible story says is that they came from far away. So we don't know how far or where it was, but um, there are I think there are indications that they may have been from India or from China,
Right.
or someplace very far away like that. But so yeah, there have always been these civilizations that have had these encounters, and therefore have stories about them. And some of the stories about the aliens are actually, well, now they're considered creation myths,
Uh-huh.
but they're probably not myths. They're probably based on somebody's eyewitness account,
Okay.
and been handed on and passed down. And many times they're not even about creation. Like, so this was another book that I wrote, the Enuma Elish, and this is
Hmm.
based on the Sumerian mythology.
Right.
But again, it's not mythology. It's literally, this book is actually the story told from a first person point of view of one of the aliens who came to Earth, or several
Okay.
of them. Actually, it was like a whole family business
Right.
that they came from somewhere else and came to Earth. So
And
in that particular story, it is sort of a, you can call it a creation myth, because they're not claiming to create the Earth, but they are claiming to come to Earth and to either create from scratch, it's not clear, or at least
right.
genetically modify what later become the human race.
Right. Right. Which is when you think of it, I think well, back then, even now, there's always a debate. If they're here, what are they doing here? What do they want? And
Right.
if you take it in as in we're talking that they've been visiting the earth, even from the times of ancient civilizations. Okay, so what do they want? They haven't gotten it by now. And then you hear all these theories about um,
Yeah.
hybridization, genetic materials. And of course, there's different. Is there more than one race or species of extraterrestrials? You get into that whole. Did some of the ancient ones leave, and now the ones that are around today, are they different ones? And the
Yeah,
reason
those are
why,
really good questions.
right, you have this, and the reason why I asked the thing about is that nowadays, even though we're primed because of whether modern society, news outlets, you name it, just people are more primed to accepting whether it's a UFO sighting or an extraterrestrial contact, positive or negative, depends. Everybody's got a different. But I'm thinking we're talking, let's say, around that time period. All right. You would think that if they had a sighting of any type, and of course contact, I would think most people would be scared initially, because
Yeah,
they they understand on some level whoever or whatever this is more powerful than I am. They just landed in a craft,
absolutely.
or they're, you know. Uh, so
Yeah.
what you're talking about in that other book that you said about the Sumerians is that we're actually talking beyond the first contact. There's an actual integration into the society of that
Hmm.
time period. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So, well, according to the Enuma Elish, now, what I have done in this book is I have not done any interpretation in terms of translating from Sumerian to English.
Okay.
What I've done is I've taken the open source translations that already exist, and
Mm-hmm.
I basically just interjected a little bit of my own commentary. It's pretty short. Like the book is um, probably over half of this book is the actual Sumerian, just the Sumerian texts translated into English. So, but the funny thing is that I okay, I'm a computer engineer.
Mm-hmm.
I've done built a lot of software and that kind of stuff, and so I have I have these things in my mind that I understand, like virtualization, databases, simulations. And when I read the story, these things are all jumping out at me that this story is a story about computer software. It is about primarily about cosmic navigation, computer systems, databases, and having to um, uh, essentially having to recalibrate that data because they are moving from uh, a place where they used to be. They have
Mm-hmm.
either stolen or reverse engineered or something. They've got this software
Okay.
from Tiamat, who used to have the software, and now they're planning to come to Earth, and they
Right.
have to recalibrate their software so that they can figure out, where they are, and so what it gets a lot into the what you might recognize as the signs of the zodiac, but they're
Okay.
really just constellations that happen to be in a circular pattern around the orbit of Earth. So these constellations are, you could use any constellations, but these are handy because they fit on the horizon as the
Mm-hmm.
Earth spins. And so these are the star patterns that they used in order
Okay.
to determine a fixed location for where Earth is, because they needed to know where they were. They just pulled out of maybe they just pulled out a warp drive or
Okay.
whatever. I don't know how that part works,
Right.
but they found themselves in a strange region of space, and they had to figure out, okay, well, where are we? They had to get their bearings in terms of where they came from. So that's truly what the zodiac is. It has nothing to do with keeping time or seasons or calendars. It is useful for that, but that's a secondary purpose. What it is
Mm-hmm.
truly for is to figure out where is Earth located in terms of the rest of the cosmos that we already know about.
Right,
Because they
right. It's
already knew
in the
about
middle
these
of all these
stars.
star systems or exactly, right.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's and that's do you think that the extraterrestrials that like you've read about in all these texts, do you think that they're still around or do you think that at some point they departed if that was their plans to begin with?
Yeah. Well, of course, the texts that I am examining specifically so
Mhm.
far are pretty ancient, and they are generally talking. Well, so the Enuma Elish specifically talks about how they got here. It does not mention them leaving, but that's because the story doesn't. It's like the story ends partway through their story. Um, there are many other oral traditions as well as other ancient writings that I admit I have not really specifically dove into yet, but are
Okay.
part of my ongoing research now. And many of these other stories are do have elements of the aliens leaving. For
Okay.
example, there is a Hebrew um, legend, I guess I'll call it. Um, I have not yet examined it in the actual Hebrew, but the translation of it basically implies that the there were I don't know who they're even talking about, but there were some. It's a story about basically similar to kind of a Nephilim the
Okay.
Nephilim story where the sons of God came and had children with the human women. And so this story, the difference on this story is the twist is that the women fled the scene, and
Okay.
one of them was left behind on Earth. Presumably, we are her descendants, and the other six fled to the Pleiades, which
Okay.
is in very close to Orion, and both of those are basically in the Taurus constellation, which is the exact opposite side from us as the galactic core. So
Okay.
I find it interesting that there is there, as you do any kind of reading or even just watching the programming that's widely available, is that a lot of people are talking about Orion, a lot of people are talking about the Pleiades, and they're
Hmm.
basically the same thing. Um, and what's the other one there? I feel like I'm missing another constellation that's next door.
Well, and you know what? I'm glad you brought that up because, there's always been that talk about the missing link. We're talking like Darwin, evolution, and everything. But the truth is, they have never, ever found the missing link, which is supposedly that jump from a hominid, like as in a primate, to modern man. They can't
Right.
find it.
Well,
There's been a
can
lot
I?
of as a matter of fact, Piltdown Man. It turned out that was a big hoax. So.
Yeah. Well, so the thing is, there were a lot of hoaxes in the early days of hominid archaeology,
Hmm.
and to this day, a lot of the evidence that we have in that field is based on very scant evidence, such
Hmm.
as a single tooth becomes a new species, or in some
Right.
cases, like this tiny finger bone, right? Like that's all they got, and how do they know that it's a different species? Now I believe that we're making a lot of progress on that. There's a lot of DNA analysis going on.
Right.
But the most fascinating thing about it is that what we're finding in recent years, because of advanced DNA technology, and just because of the amount of work that's going on now, because if you think about how many people there were in 1920 who were specializing in archaeology, like a couple dozen in the world, maybe
Right.
tops. Now we're churning out, like our academic machine is so vast. Like we're just churning out so many scholars, um, and there's so much information available that we are able to comb over the work of other people and people who published 50 or 100 years ago, and we're bringing new data to bear on that, and new ways of looking at things. And so one of the biggest things that I'm really excited about is the whole Neanderthal and Denisovan connections,
Yes.
which are essentially Neanderthal never went extinct. We are Neanderthal.
Right. Exactly. They
I got
realized
my
that they all interbred. In other words.
Yeah, and so I got my DNA results back from 23andMe, and I'm 4% Neanderthal,
I'm
which
three
is
percent
among the highest
Neanderthal.
you can get. There you go. So between the two of us, we represent more than probably 97% of the DNA. How am I saying this? Anyway, that those percentages are a lot more than most people, but almost everyone has a little bit, like a tiny,
Mhm.
tiny fraction of a percentage. So when you consider things like that, and they've also found a specific individual who was a caveman, a young girl, and
Mhm.
her DNA showed that she was like basically almost half Neanderthal, half Cro-Magnon, I believe it was, or else it was
Right.
Denisovan. So anyway, there was a lot of um, intermixing
Yes. Yes.
culturally and
Yes.
sexually, and we are the result of this huge melting pot,
Yes.
not only of like current humanity, but from going a long ways back. It's also interesting, just in terms of DNA analysis. If any of your listeners, probably many of them, have done 23andMe, and what
Mhm.
I found most fascinating when I first got it was, um, okay, I knew that I was like, I was expecting half Dutch and a quarter English, quarter Scottish.
Right.
Well, and those were all big in there, but then there were all these little things like 5%, or some in the 1 to 10% range of
Right.
all of these other places that are far away from there. And
Mhm.
how did those people uh,
Yes.
get my great 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 grandmother pregnant? Like,
Right.
how does that work? Because we have this concept that for thousands of years people have just been living in the same place, farming away, or doing their thing, and nobody traveled because they were all just a bunch of poor farmers. It's not the
Right.
case at all.
Right.
Um, so, like, really everything that we know is wrong,
Right. Well,
and
they
that's
they
one really good
they
example.
exactly. They, as a matter of fact, that Easter Island, the Rapa Nui, which were Polynesians,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
were, and of course, like you said, with the use of DNA, for example, they were looking at some of these giant heads, stone heads, very similar. Well, no, I'll take that back. Not all of them are similar to the ones on Easter Island. There was one that supposedly is out in the jungles of Guatemala, but the tribes in that area, that was their thing, that they would carve these huge heads with a couple of tons. There was one that was unlike the features of the other ones. It turns out
hmm
that they recently did a DNA on 27 Rapa Nui, which are people from the Easter Islands. Okay. And if based on that finding, it shows that the Polynesians went all the way and came up either to the coast of Chile or Peru, traveled in to the interior of Guatemala, and then came back out and went back to the Easter Island. In other words, when they looked
yeah,
at the genome, it's like it wasn't just a happenstance one time thing. And they were saying that
right.
there's trying to draw the correlation between the carvings of these big giant heads, just like they had on Easter Island. The features are different, but I guess that whatever it is that prompts them to do that. And nobody ever
hmm
thought that the Polynesians could travel that far away, much less going to the interior, obviously, mate, breed, whatever you want to call it, bring them back to Easter Island and then go. In other words,
Right.
like you said, a lot of times we kind of shortchange some of these older civilizations, thinking, oh, they're limited. They can't do
Absolutely.
that. And
Yeah.
supposedly
And
these
and
Polynesians don't even have they had their own way of their own navigation system, and
totally.
they made
And
it.
so these guys, our ancestors, or not necessarily directly, but there have been people all over the world, very well documented, because they have the stories and they're telling the stories, and they've never stopped telling the stories. We
Mhm,
just don't listen. But it is actually very well documented that people in all throughout southern Asia, Polynesia, down to Australia,
mhm,
as well as on the Pacific coast, in both North America and South America, both coasts. People have always been seafaring.
yes,
This whole idea that they didn't have boats is utter bullshit.
yes,
There's zero evidence for it, and the evidence against it has been looking us in the face literally for hundreds of years. So based on the thing that you were just talking about, the giant heads, you might be referring to some of the Olmec statues,
yes, the Olmecs,
that
exactly.
are, yeah. And the Olmecs, these giant heads in Mexico and Mesoamerica and South America
Mhm,
were discovered over 100 years ago,
yes.
and people at the time looked at them and said, "Now this is going to be a little bit racist, but
No, I know
this is what
exactly what you're gonna
at,
say, what you're
the
going.
time."
Yes, I know that. I know what you're gonna say,
They
but go
looked
ahead.
at one. They took one look at this carving and said, "That's an African.
Mhm,
That's a Negro."
yes,
And, well, yeah, it looks exactly like, basically, my friend from Nigeria looks very similar to this one carved head. And that's not to say that, everybody
But see,
looks
that's
the
the thing
same,
that they
but
showed pictures though of Aboriginals and of indigenous people, and they look exactly, and
yeah.
they look like those statues. So it was
Hmm.
like, in other words, that again, people sometimes also get this preconceived idea of indigenous people having to look a certain way, and that could
Right.
change depending on the area as far as their features per se. Um,
Absolutely. And there has always been migration um, of people and
mhm,
migration of the gene pool with constant
right,
stirring. So it's ridiculous to think that everybody always looks the same way if they're in this one particular area. Even if there is patterns that are recognizable, there are always the exceptions and people who look the opposite.
right,
I mean, red hair is a good example.
mhm,
And it's been easily tracked for through many different cultures that occasionally somebody would pop up with red hair
yes,
in places where there generally isn't any, and
mhm.
so it's the same kind of thing. Um,
Well, did you have you
and
ever heard of these Olmecs when you said, and I want that they discovered this is in a little town south of in southern Guatemala called La Democracia. It's like a village. It's not really even a town. Back in the 1930s, they say 1950s, but if you look at the picture, there's a car next to it to scale it. Looks like the 1930s.
okay,
They did find one of these large heads, but the features look a lot more like Easter Island versus the other Olmec ones, which have the wider nose, the bigger
yeah,
lips. I don't know if have you ever seen that picture?
I
Um,
have seen that. I don't have a copy of it, but I have seen
right,
that.
right.
Some of these pictures are, frankly, really difficult to find,
Yes,
which kind of makes you wonder if they're being suppressed. Um,
yes.
and there is definitely absolutely no question that there is information being suppressed. But I have no, I'm not really interested in speculating in terms of which exact pieces of information. But if you look at the track record of the Smithsonian in how they have treated giant remains, um,
Mhm.
there's a huge cover up going on there. Which really shouldn't be any surprise because cover ups have always been the way to keep things under wraps. And why do we need to keep things under wraps? I don't know, but part of it is to control the narrative
Right,
so that
exactly,
you can have
exactly.
power. Right.
Exactly, because it makes you
Um,
think I know a lot of these academics, especially back then, there's a lot of ego involved in their discoveries. Like you said,
Absolutely.
this is the version we're gonna put out, and we don't wanna go back and say we were wrong or
Yep.
we guesstimated wrong on the
Absolutely.
years.
And still, that's still happening. And thankfully, it's we're in this kind of age where it's harder to get away with that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
but it still is happening.
Sure.
And let's look at Egypt
Yes.
specifically because there's a guy named Zahi Hawass who, for 30 years, did his level best to stop any kind of progress at all in Egypt.
Right.
Why would he do that? His job was he was the head of um, basically the whole cultural department of
Mhm.
archaeology. I forget what they call it, but essentially
Antiquities,
any
whatever.
antiquities. Yeah, exactly. So anything that had to do with ancient Egypt and museums or archaeology was under his purview. He was in charge of it, and he had final say in terms of who was allowed to do what and say what about ancient Egypt. Um,
Mhm.
and he made some extremely bold claims. Uh, at one point, I read a quote by him that said, and this was probably dated, I'm thinking of probably about 10 to 15 years ago, he said this, and that was, I'm directly quoting him, there is nothing new to find on the Giza Plateau. All discoveries of any importance have already been made. Now, this is very interesting considering he was just trying to stop people from coming in. But it's
Mhm.
interesting that approximately 10 years after he claimed that, he himself made a very substantial discovery where on the Giza Plateau.
Sure.
So clearly, like,
Yeah, he's
it's just kind of amazing the kind of shit that these guys are doing.
yep.
Thankfully, he he has moved on. There was a lot of political mix up in the last 5 or 6 years in Egypt, and one of the good things that came out of that was that it sounds like the new the people who are in charge of that department now seem to be a lot more open. I know even in the last 2 years, even during COVID, there have been some pretty significant expansions in terms of what certain types of people are allowed to do and what you're allowed to go look at in Egypt. Even
Yes.
a common like a normal tourist can get access to places that have been closed for 20 years.
Right.
So
I
I
think
think good things are happening.
that people forget it's not even a question because it's not like if let's say a team from another country comes in and discovers something, they can't take it anyway. It's not the question of them taking the artifacts. I think people don't realize that there's ego involved. If anything of significance is going to be found, we want us to be the ones to find it, as in let's say an Egyptian team. That's why I
Right.
think, and I'm saying Egypt, but it could also be other countries that also do that. Okay,
Yeah,
where
for
they
sure.
want
For
to be
sure.
the
It happens everywhere. And to be honest, America's probably worse.
oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because can you even has there ever been an archaeological team come from another country to America?
Nope, nope, nope. Not that I can
Probably
think
not.
of. Right off the bat,
But
nope, nothing comes to mind.
there's plenty of interesting stuff to look at in America
Sure,
that's way older than anyone is letting on. Um,
sure.
so I live in Canada. One of the most interesting things that we've found in Canada in the last couple of years is we have scientifically proven that the local First Nations people on the Pacific coast uh, have have been telling the truth though all along when they said we've been here since the Ice Age.
Oh,
So we now have a pretty fresh archaeological site that has proven by carbon dating that that exact same group, you might think of it as a tribe. It's it's
mhm.
kind of like they have their own culture and their own traditions and language. And this particular group has been saying that they've been in that area for 12 to 14,000 years. And that's been proven by carbon dating.
Exactly.
Now, this is really interesting because what you got to realize is that about 10,000 years ago and previous to that, most of the land that they would have occupied is now
Mm,
400 feet underwater. So just think
boy.
about how much cool stuff there is if we were really to focus on underwater archaeology,
Oh,
which is
absolutely.
a
I mean,
field
I know
that
it's gotta
has
be more
very,
challenging,
very little.
obviously, because of,
Yeah.
you've gotta dive, but, yes, of course, there's a lot of things that, um, from what I'm seeing is the timeline of, how can I say, humans is much older than what we've been led to believe as far as,
Yeah.
oh, when we basically came down from the trees and, fire and then, all the other stuff that they give us, that timeline, I think we have to push it way back further, than what it
Yes,
is.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely. And so there's been a lot of really good progress on that front as well, especially around sites like Göbekli Tepe and
mhm,
certain other sites in Turkey, and as well as probably another at least a handful, possibly another dozen sites that are about the same in that same age range, and some which are possibly even much older than that.
yes.
Although we're still trying to get more solid evidence, because a lot of times it's difficult to prove, and there's guesswork involved. But until 10 years ago, um, everyone thought, and nobody could prove otherwise, that the first civilization was ancient Sumeria in 3000 BC.
Right.
So Göbekli Tepe pushed that back by double,
Mm-hmm.
because it's now there's civilization 12,000 years ago.
Yes.
So it's huge, and you can't ignore that. And I think that's really been one of the sort of major shifts in the field of archaeology, is that a lot of people who would have spent 30 years going, no, 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 it's garbage, or yeah, whatever. Well, they
Well,
can't argue with it anymore. Like
there was
Gobekli
no
Tepe is absolutely inarguable.
right. Exactly. It's like, okay, you can't. It's like, I don't know. I'm sure you're familiar with the Leakeys, which was a family that did a lot of the,
Yeah,
how can I say, the excavations, the digs for all these, again, in search of the missing link. Turns out these
yeah,
people, in other words, you couldn't say they were wrong. You couldn't, you couldn't go
right,
against their word. Whatever they said was, that's it. If they did all the link.
right.
And come to find out, a lot of their stuff was, I don't want to say manipulated, but people, they wanted to hold on to their power, and God
Yeah,
forbid they should say, what we claimed as far as this finding. And like you said, all that maybe they found was maybe a finger or a tooth or a
yeah,
molar.
yeah.
um
So, well, that's the thing, is a lot of people can't say, you know what, I was wrong, even if it was 50 years ago. But there's
yes.
actually good reason for that, because some of these people, um, now it's not probably not the same now, but back in the day when these guys were doing their work, if the Leakeys were to admit that they had made a mistake, even a small single mistake, they would have been fired, and they would have been blacklisted, and no one would have hired them, which is really difficult, because in their line of work, there were probably 5 universities,
Right.
which were, world class, where they could have got jobs, and they wouldn't have hired them.
Right. All
And
their
so
work
what are
was
they going to
dependent on
do?
grants.
Yeah. So it's either you're going to be flipping burgers, or sweeping floors, or
Yeah.
you have to lie. And that's a very
Yeah.
shitty position to be in.
Right.
And the reason for it is not because of anything that they did, but because of the idiotic, like, way that the institutions are set up. Can you imagine working at a university where, if you say, okay, so imagine you're the university administrator.
Hmm.
Somebody comes into you and says, "Hey, you know what? I made a mistake." Oh, you're fired. That's going to be
Right.
your response, obviously, right? No,
Right. Or
that's
no, no, no,
stupid.
no,
Like,
no, we're not gonna go with that verse. Well, but you know what? That thing that I thought was, no, 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 no. We're not gonna do that because we're very prestigious. And I tell everybody, that first movie of Jurassic Park, at the very beginning, how they're on this dig for in the middle of nowhere and this little trailer. People don't realize all these archaeological digs from universities, they're funded by grants. Okay, somebody's got to pay for them to sit out there
yeah,
and dig in the dirt, sometimes without
yeah,
coming up with it for anything. All right. So this is part of what you're saying is, not only if I want to keep my job, but if I want to keep on exploring out here, I need
mhm,
money to do that.
exactly. And they love what they're doing.
Yes,
So, I mean, it's got to be very tempting, right? That's all
of
I'm
course.
saying. I'm not saying that they were right, or that certainly that the university was right, but that's the way it is. And economy is always a problem.
Sure.
Economy is a problem no matter what you're doing. Um, I mean, I
Or
have a
if,
day
or
job.
if that university or whoever's funding it, which a lot of them are universities, even though now there's a lot of private corporations, or if that's the narrative they want. No,
Yeah,
that's not what we want to, no, that's not what we want to put out because, no. Yeah, okay, we'll take that
right,
into, in the meantime, you're going to not talk about that.
right.
And I'm sure
So
even now,
you've got the academy doing that. You've got governments doing that.
sure.
Not
Mhm.
probably from a different standpoint. You've got
Yes.
religious institutions doing that. So there's all these pressures that you
Yes.
have to somehow live up to, like whatever the hell that it is that the powers that be want right now. And yeah, it's actually a really crazy field. So I'm glad that I have a day job because my livelihood is completely not tied to
To one
my
thing to the
ability to
other.
say whatever the
Exactly.
hell I want. Right.
Exactly. People don't realize that when you have somebody that's got they can control your income or your livelihood. Yeah, that makes a big difference as to like, well, I guess I'm just gonna have to shut up about this. you know.
Exactly. And imagine, I mean, imagine that you go on Facebook and you say whatever opinion you happen to have about any particular topic, and the next day your boss gives you shit about it.
Oh
That's
yes,
not cool, man. But that's the
yes,
kind of stuff that these guys had to deal with.
right, right. And I know that a lot of these and the flip side of it is that some of these wherever these universities or that they have this, how can I say, this reputation, they're it's all about more about their reputation. Let's say in academics, oh, this came from so and so university, so it's gospel, it's like it's got to be the truth.
Yeah.
Very
Yep.
very rarely do they ever go back and eventually what happens is the people that were involved in it die or anybody that could be around to say, hey, that's not exactly right, they die, as time goes by.
Right.
So it's like, okay, we're in the clear, our version is the accepted one, and that's the way it's going to be for whatever reason,
Right.
whether it's
Right.
just
That's why
ego
it takes
or
yeah, that's why it takes 20 to 50 years to see any change in academia.
yes, they say the
Yeah.
old people that'll die. I hate to say that, but that's what you hear. It's only when the old guards go, push up daisies, that then you start seeing, whether you want to call it a renaissance or, hey, new ideas, things of this nature come up or accepted. How's that,
Yeah.
entertained?
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
and which I think it's a shame, but again, people don't realize that a lot of these academics have real big egos, and
Hmm. Well, and that even with that, none of that change would happen if it weren't for people who were willing to stick their neck out. And these
Mhm.
guys are getting bullied and harassed, even if they have nothing to do with academia.
Sure.
You have a guy like, say, Graham Hancock, for example, who is
Yes.
a journalist, and he starts talking about some interesting stuff. And what happens? He's getting publicly derided
Yes.
by the academics, and like, why? He's saying
Mm.
something. It has nothing to do with any of you guys. It's not
Right.
affecting your funding. Just like shut up. And yet it's like this
They don't
poor
want
guy. I
anybody
mean,
to
I
listen
feel
to them.
yeah.
Well, 2 weeks ago they had this here in the Senate met to have UFO discussions. Something they hadn't done in 50
Mhm.
years. Very, and I asked
Well,
myself, why
no,
now?
that's not true. The Congress has met over the UFO subject on at least 5 occasions in the last 5 years that I know of, and
Really?
I don't even live in your country.
I
There
didn't
was
know
in
that.
2013, there was a big thing. This was before both before and after the first round of naval videos that were leaked with the
Mhm.
I forget which one it was. The Nimitz, I believe, was that one.
Okay.
So that was happening then. A few years later, well, that was really picked up by I can't think of the fellow's name right now. There was a guy who was just doing so much work. Basically, his entire focus uh, was full time, um, basically lobbying Congress and the powers that be in DC, and he spent several years doing that full time, and which resulted in a few congressional hearings. Then it was also picked up by um, the guy from Blink 182. I forget his name now.
Mhm.
Um, and he did a few hearings with Congress, and that was all around sort of between 2013 and 2018. That was all happening, And then, of course, there was the other disclosure that came from the Navy with the other videos, the Go Fast video, the Tic Tac
Right.
video,
Mm-hmm.
and of course that prompted another round. So there was some in 2019. I believe there was some in 2021, and then now again now. So I find it very strange that everyone thinks this is the first time.
Well, this is what
Um,
believe it or not, that's what I understood. It was like, Senate has
yeah,
now met to discuss UFOs for 50 years. I was like, wow, okay, why now? What's going on? And one
yeah,
of the things I do not recall the senator's name. There was one who said that, they're all talking about the importance of UFOs and what UFOs, that they're considering, do we need to look at people putting out misinformation about UFOs? Should they be prosecuted or looked at? And I was like, what?
right. So here's an interesting point. He is putting out misinformation regarding UFOs by allowing the press
Mm-hmm.
to carry the story that this is the first time. They're doing this willingly and manipulatively. This
Right.
is absolutely 100% suppression on one hand, but disclosure on the other. The
Sure.
right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, and that's on purpose because they're very conveniently forgetting about where we're at because of the progress we've already made, and just making it seem like every time somebody says something, they're the hero for finally stepping up and saying something. Um, it just doesn't fly. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
However, this is sort of the whole thing: is that there definitely is a lot of work going into controlling the narrative around the
Sure.
UAP phenomenon, and that work is, um, well, who knows what the motive is or what the end game
Do you
is,
think it
but I
has
mean,
something to
clearly,
do that UFO is one of the most, how can I say, one of the most used or terms, if you go into Google search, one of the most searched for terms, do you think has anything to do with that?
mhm. Well, that certainly helps when it comes to selling books. And I
Well,
can only tell you that
I'm
because
just saying
I
as far
also
as
have a
controlling the
novel.
narrative, it's like, oh, if we've got
Yeah,
these many people are listening or interested in this, this is not just
yeah,
some.
that's definitely true. So, I mean, people in power always are interested in having ears to talk to.
Yes.
So definitely that is certainly a factor. But it is to me very interesting the things that they're saying right now because the content that is currently being spewed is absolutely 100% contradictory to everything that we have already learned about this. If you've been following the UFO phenomenon for any length of time, you
Do you
already know
think?
about Bob Lazar.
Of course.
Um,
But
we
that's the
already
whole
know
thing.
about
Why now all of a sudden they're looking at anybody that's going to put out misinformation? In other words, you, me, anybody wants to talk about UFOs that they consider misinformation. It's like, okay, no, we got to control this. So everybody here that wants to talk about it or put forth an explanation or a story, nope. And when I heard that, I was like, what in the world is that about? People have been talking about UFOs or giving their theories for how long? Now all of a
yeah.
sudden,
Oh, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you guys have an amendment about that
yes, we do,
in
but
your constitution?
I could, that's a whole nother show. I could go into what happened with our amendments, but when I heard that, it was like, what are you talking about? He brought it up like, oh, we have to consider like how important this thing with the UFOs is that people, and of course the way they phrase it is very putting out misinformation, and I was like, wow, that
Yeah.
could be anything you want it to be, you know.
Yeah. So what strikes me the most right now is that the officials, the stuffed shirts, and the talking heads are really fear mongering about
Sure.
around the whole thing because now they're really using a lot of language like threat and
Yeah.
concern and security and things like this, where it's like, okay, well, first of all, you guys obviously know that it's not a threat because if you
Hmm.
know anything about UFOs, you know that they've been on US soil for since at least from 1947 and very, very well documented ever since. Every year since 1947. And there's been task force after task force, and probably not, it's probably not an over exaggeration to say billions of dollars have been invested in both investigating, securing, and controlling the narrative around the
Sure.
UFO and now UAP. This is not some, oh, is it true or not investigation. This is absolutely, we know that we're dealing with something here, and we also know that it's not a threat because we've been dealing with it for 50, well, more than that, 70 years. So after 70 years, the government is now trying to put a spin on it that, oh, it's dangerous. Why? Because they want to scare you like
Mhm.
everything else they're doing. The whole thing that happened in Texas and
Yes.
like everything that happens on CNN is 100% designed to
Yes.
scare you.
Yes,
Um,
it is.
I'm
It
not
is.
an American. I don't have that kind of shit flying in my face every day. And thank God, because I could not even live in your country. Like,
But you know what it
seriously.
is? It's that, and I guess again, if you want to say it, it's like before you had three main channels and newspapers. In other words, you
Hmm.
get it instantaneously in your face in living color with full details. Okay.
Yep.
And
Yep.
people don't realize the effect of that constant anxiety. Why do you think, there's always been people with insomnia. Don't get me wrong. That's a human condition. But nowadays, they're even selling NyQuil to go to sleep. Why do you think why do you
Hmm.
think people have such a hard time getting a night's sleep, even when there's nothing wrong? It's because we're getting so bombarded during our
Yeah.
waking hours
Everything is wrong.
with
Everything is
so
wrong all
much
the
negativity.
time.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
everything, by the way, is you're on the edge of the precipice. It's like,
Yeah.
huh? Oh my God. And
Yeah.
I tell everybody that because I used to do, I still am a hypnotherapist, but I used to run a hypnotherapy center for a while, for a few years. And people don't realize that what will put you into a hypnotic trance is anxiety. All right. And by that, I
Mhm.
mean is that if you're in a hypnotic trance, with your eyes open, everybody thinks that you have to be with your eyes closed. Everything that you see, hear, everything that you take in goes direct into your subconscious mind. Okay.
Right.
Where usually, if you're not hypnotized, you have a filter that'll say, that sounds kind of like, in other words, you filter it, you think it out, you analyze it. And a lot of times you don't accept it as truth. How's that? Whereas when you're in a
Right.
hypnotic trance produced by anxiety, everything it goes straight into your subconscious mind. And of course, it takes root there. And that's why a lot of people, sometimes they find a large amount of people, unfortunately, find themselves worrying, like, besides their own personal things, it's like everything is the end of the world is around the corner kind of deal. You know?
Absolutely. And that's exactly the intent of the American propaganda machine, which,
Yes.
by the way, is working on a scale far greater and vaster and more effective and efficient than the Nazi propaganda machine ever was.
Oh, well, of course, because just thank the internet is wonderful for a lot of things, but for in other, how can I say, it's just the media, whether it's via the internet, with nowadays a lot of people, that's how they get their information. Uh, I'm going to give you a perfect example: the Johnny Depp Amber Heard uh,
Mm.
trial. I remember yesterday. I'm looking at my phone. I'm getting at 3 p.m. They're going to say and I was like, what? Because I really didn't follow it. I saw a couple of
Right.
headlines, but I really didn't follow it. And it was like monumental, you know. And all we're
Right.
talking about is
Right.
two celebrities that they had a nasty divorce, and now one was suing the other for defamation. It was like, okay,
Who
but
cares? Like, how is this literally going to change my life? But it does because
yes,
we invite it into our life and
yes,
we say, this is important. In fact,
yes,
this is now life or death. And this is the thing is that I think that's why America is so polarized because
yes,
with a two-party system and everything is life or death, and
yes,
everyone has to now control everyone else around them.
everything,
It's not
yes,
okay to just have your opinion. You
yes,
have to make sure that everyone knows your opinion. And
yes.
it's crazy, and I don't know how
Let me
anybody
tell
can
you
live
something.
with that, to be honest.
And that's, you know what, and you're absolutely right. There was a time where, how can I say it, for lack of a better word, because I'm old enough to know that, to grow up in that, where differences were tolerated, whether they were political differences, whatever. It was like, okay, it's
Mhm.
okay. It's not the end of the world. How's that? It's not earth
Yeah.
shattering. It's like, all right,
Right.
I'll wait till the
Right.
next
And
election come around, or whatever it was. Even on the local level, if
yeah.
whatever it was not so monumental. Something much closer to home had to impact you on that level, whether it was a loved one or something like that. Then that's when, okay, things are really serious. But all these other things were important, but not the way they are now, where it's like
Yeah.
you said, it's life or death. Everything is. Um,
Yeah. It's interesting that you say, like, so basically you're comparing it, but almost not even metaphorically. You're essentially saying that we are all hypnotized,
yes.
and I think you're right. And another way of saying that would be because I have a book on the subject of magic. It makes sense to me to think about it that everyone is under a spell,
Mm-hmm.
because really, what is a spell? A spell is well, there's a lot of different kinds of spells. There's some that are physical manifestations, but
Right.
there are some that are essentially uh, um, the fact of altering the mental state of a person.
Yes.
And the funny thing is when you can alter the mental state of a person, you actually are creating a physical manifestation because that person literally goes and does things based on that thought pattern that you have like set up in their mind. So it's very interesting, the fact that uh, really our entire society, and this goes far beyond America and politics, but our entire civilization now is built on information. And what is information but a spell? So I'm looking at you through a camera, which is
Mm-hmm.
casting a spell onto my computer, and my
Yes.
computer is casting a spell on me, and I cast spells back onto my computer. And it's this whole big firestorm of spells that are happening. And it's not necessarily bad, it's not necessarily good, but what it really says to me is that this really harkens back to the very, very earliest stories that we have, which are also talking about these same things. You think of in the book of Genesis in the Bible, we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's really the story that it's telling, is that there's information, there's knowledge, there's thought patterns that we interface with that are both the best thing in the world and killing us.
Sure. Yeah. The technology has a lot of benefits. And the way I look at it is exactly what you just described, whether it's the camera. Basically, it acts as the portal for the spell. Okay. Once upon
Hmm.
a time when there was no internet, let's say no cell phones, not even pagers. Let's go back to just a simple
Hmm.
phone line. Okay.
Yeah,
The only point of entry was somebody would call you, and if nobody answered, they hang up, and that was it. And or send you snail mail. End of story. This was the
that's
only
right.
point of entry to access you. All right. People didn't
Right.
expect you to
And
be
those were powerful.
always available.
Those were powerful points too.
Yes.
I actually experienced healing through a telephone, and
Okay.
also over TV. Um,
Mhm.
so it's interesting that there are things that can direct physical manifestation of the human body without necessarily even interfacing through the mind. I mean, I guess in a way it is. Maybe it's all in my head. So
Well,
somebody told
let
me
me
I
ask
was
something.
healed. It's
Don't you
all in my
think
head, but I was.
behind every, whether you want to call it a spell, whether you want to call it healing,
Yeah.
it all comes down
Yeah.
to intent. Okay. Intent.
Hmm.
All right.
Right.
Now, if you could say, well, you know what? Everybody that has access to me, let's say via the internet, let's go that route. I know that their intent
Yeah.
is positive, but you can't, but we can't do that. There's no, we have no filter to say what we're seeing or what maybe a one-to-one, let's say like what we're having now. What is the intent of that person in some instances? If you could control
Right.
that, you could say,
Well,
okay,
I would posit to you that you can control that.
how?
And I will give myself as an example
Okay.
because um, I I am, I wouldn't say I was cautious, but I am careful
Mhm.
about the types of applications that I use,
Okay.
and how I do that. So I do use social media. I use Facebook primarily. I do a lot of stuff on YouTube, and I also watch a lot of cool stuff on YouTube. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I I experimented with Twitter and with what's the video thing? Uh, Come on,
Within
the
with
8 seconds of video or whatever.
oh
Uh,
TikTok.
anyway,
Yeah.
TikTok, yeah. So I have accounts on both of those, and I once in a while will log in if I have to make a post, mostly. But
Mm-hmm.
I basically avoid those two places like the plague because they are absolute filth. Like the shit that I see as soon as I log in there makes me instantly angry, or
Mm-hmm.
just like I just don't want to see this. So
Yes.
what do? I don't log into those.
Yeah.
And how do I control Facebook? One time went through my feed, or sorry, went through my friends list, and I didn't unfriend anybody, but I unfollowed over like there was hundreds of people.
All right.
So I unfollowed everyone. And then I thought, okay, well, who are the people that actually have interesting things to say that I want to hear from? And
Sure.
I followed them back. So so it is a lot of work.
Yes.
But
Yes.
right now my Facebook feed is a very positive place,
Well, you know what? I
which I
think
don't
also,
think.
Ken, at the beginning, myself included, how can I say? We went into a lot of the social media kind of like, oh, it's a place to like share pictures of your kids or the family of the vacation or my cat or my dog or my farm or my, or, just talk or people.
Yeah,
I don't think people realized at that point how much of themselves they were putting in that now they didn't see the eternity of social media in the
right,
sense of what you
right,
post once it's there, it's there. And let's say most ordinary people didn't think of it that way. And now, when people come to realize, they're scraping information, this information is manipulated. Also, who has access to this information that you would think who'd be interested in me?
hmm
I'm like, nobody. People are
right.
becoming
But is
more,
that necessarily a bad thing? And I've
no,
had this conversation hundreds of times, but I I'm all for Google scraping all of the data that it can get on me because it benefits me directly. How
sure,
so? I only see advertisements for cool stuff
sure.
that I think is cool because that they know what I think is cool. So I would much rather see the same ad, even though it gets repetitive, than always be seeing a whole bunch of other random
But
ads that
you
I
know what?
really don't care about.
I think it would be different if this tech, whoever the tech is, whether it's Google, anybody, Facebook, whatever,
Mhm.
they would ask you, do you want us to give you recommendations based on your activity? Okay. Whereas people were realizing I'm being manipulated. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the stories. People
Well,
will be
they
looking
do
at
have that.
something,
You
and
can
then all
you
of a sudden
can
you start getting all this advertising for this. And it's like
yeah
nobody likes, I
yeah.
think, to
So
be watched.
well, that's true. But I will say that at least most of the sites that I have
Oh,
looked at, they actually do ask you, like, for example, on
now they're
your
doing
both Facebook and Google, they have always had when they started doing the smart ads,
yeah.
it was an opt-in thing. Now, I don't know if they've changed their policy, maybe. But you're right. Like, definitely nobody asked me if I would allow voice recognition software on my wife's phone to control what I see. Like, that's weird.
Yes.
And you're right. There's definitely a high level of espionage happening.
Yes.
And do
Exactly.
people have are people stealing your data? Absolutely, they are.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people at the beginning didn't get it. We were so overwhelmed with the
Yeah,
convenience of the technology, whether it was social media or phones, et cetera, et cetera. Even though, of
right.
course, and I have my own, like I said, I've lived long enough to realize what its life is like without these. There's times that I'm very glad I have it, but there's times it was
Mhm.
like I want to like dig a hole in my backyard and bury it there and never bring it up.
Yeah.
But um, again, it's like, and you have to understand also that because of that, what we were talking way back earlier, which is controlling the narrative. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
even to the point, and
So
My husband gets mad when the phone tells him to turn down the volume, and they don't realize sometimes you
Yeah.
have it connected to, let's say, one of these Bluetooth speakers. So you turn up the volume, so you know it'll sound loud. And he's like, "This stupid thing is telling me to turn up the volume." And it's like, on its face, it might seem like something very simple, but I think that it's very insidious. Where I know how to modulate volume to my comfort level. Don't worry about it. That's thanks. I
Yeah,
kind of
yeah. But you're right, because it is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil,
yes.
as everything is. That metaphor applies to literally everything.
Mhm.
That might be the most brilliant part of the entire Bible right there. But
I think
okay,
that
so earlier, because we're talking about motivation and controlling the narrative and this kind of
mhm,
thing. So it's obvious to me that the ETs have been here for at least 10,000 years, um, possibly way longer, and they haven't destroyed us yet. Although they probably have tried to, and they probably actually have destroyed us several times and then rebuilt us, which is one of the reasons why um, your point to the missing link is that yeah, no, we were basically trashed and rebooted, and uh, there's no direct flow because it's an abrupt stop and a new upgrade. You can't, if you look at your old computer that had Windows 95 on it,
mhm,
there is no slow transition to the
no.
computer you have now. There's only abrupt transitions when you bought a new computer and it had the new system on it, and it's entirely possible that that is what has happened to us as a human species and possibly to every other species on Earth. Um,
Do you think then the stories of Atlantis an Atlantis-like civilization are true or have some basis in truth?
well, absolutely. Let's look at this from a practical point of view. So, um, who is it that we know of who is a very smart and well-respected Greek scholar who is the biggest proponent of where we're getting our information for Atlantis? It's
Plato?
Plato. Well,
Mhm.
Plato is basically everything that Plato says is the basis for science and religion that we currently still use to this day. And there is maybe there's some twists and some refinements, but essentially the entire concept of scientific discovery and the entire most of our very basic religious concepts all come from Plato. So Plato's like the ultimate go-to dude who we all love and adore, and he can do no wrong. Oh, except for this one thing that he said that was total horseshit.
Yeah.
Really, really. So not only that, but he gives very well documented history for where he's getting this information. He says specifically that this information was given to him by not. He's not making it up. He said, my ancestor Solon told me this information, probably in writing because Solon was several generations earlier. I don't believe it was his grandfather. I believe it was his great great grandfather. Um,
Mhm.
and Solon's information was also very well documented because it was passed on to him during a trip to Egypt, where now keep in mind at this, not everybody could just pick up and go from Greece to Egypt.
Sure.
Solon was funded, academically funded, um, possibly by the state or someone with deep pockets who was specifically paying for Solon's expedition to Egypt, specifically to gather information and to learn. So he was maybe you could maybe think of him as I was going to say a transfer student, but that's not really very accurate because Solon was like literally like the number one um, head philosopher probably at his time. He was certainly very high ranked. So we have a very, very high ranking, well funded individual going from Greece to Egypt and then passing that information along to Plato. And what Solon found in Egypt was he was able to, because of his credentials, he was able to speak to the number one guy in Egypt, who probably was working directly under the pharaoh, and this was a fellow who is unnamed, but he's called the high priest in Plato's story. So Solon was able to essentially have this guy as his mentor, and he was studying with this fellow in Egypt for I'm not sure how long, but it was not a brief period. He was there for quite some time, and while he was there, they went and they looked at like the Book of the Dead, which is something that is pretty conventional in terms of, yeah, this is what we know that the Egyptians had, and I think our interpretation of it is maybe a little skewed, but this is the type of stuff that these guys were studying. And during that study, they traveled to Dendera, which is one of the early temples in Egypt, probably one of the earliest, possibly the earliest remaining temple ruins that is currently known. And at Dendera, they do have some of the same types of stories that we're used to seeing in many of the other not pyramids but other temples in Egypt, which have come to be called the Book of the Dead. And so a lot of that stuff is also encapsulated in the Dendera monuments, but also Dendera contains earlier material that predates that by thousands of years. And according to Solon, I believe Solon wrote that material was telling the story of 9,000 years prior.
Okay.
So I don't know when those temples that he was looking at were made, but somewhere during that 9,000 year period, some events happened. And then in Egypt, the people who built these temples, who again were very well funded, very deep pockets to build temples out of stone. Mm-hmm. So these guys were telling a story that was not unconventional in any way. It was funded by the government, for crying out loud. So the official government story at some point during the period between that 9,000 years from when the event was presumed to have happened and when Solon studied it, that was the official record. That was the history, right? There is no other history. That's the official record. And it clearly states that these people came from Atlantis after Atlantis was destroyed. Now, that has nothing to do with where it's located, but Plato actually does go into quite a lot of detail with some very extensive clues about its possible location and its sort of its structure and description and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, I would say that there's a ton of theories about where Atlantis might be. Basically, I haven't really seen any good evidence other than one very strange location, which you might want to check out. I would recommend watching the YouTube channel Bright Insight and check out his series on the Eye of the Sahara. Fascinating.
Okay. I know that there's a lot of different possible sites of where Atlantis or Atlantis-like civilization, which was, basically they were destroyed by cataclysm, whether you want to say that they brought it about. There's different versions of that.
But I think also that it's a bogus question. Where is Atlantis is a bogus question, because that's like saying, where is America? Well, you know that New York is in America and also LA. In 10,000 years, they're both going to be have ruins and rubble, probably buried under who knows what. But
Exactly.
to say that where is America? Well, it's New York, yes, and it's also LA, yes, it is, and it's also some little farmland in the middle of the Mississippi. It's everywhere,
Do you
and I
think
think
then
that
that
is
that
really the case.
information, if there was ever a way to verify, let's go with the Atlantis. Let's go down that rabbit hole. If
Mhm.
Do you think that they would ever let it out that if they had found a site that fit that wherever it is, wherever it ended up being, or do you
Well,
think
I
that
mean,
the powers that be would go, no, we can't go there.
yeah, it depends on who they are, I suppose. Now,
Oh,
has I mean, it's entirely possible that that the answer to that question is no. Of course, they wouldn't, and
mm,
of course, that depends on who they are. But
right.
if you look at who they are the same they that are controlling every other narrative.
Yeah, that's what I'm
So
saying.
if they're going to control every other narrative, of course they're going to control this narrative as well. So we do know that, like again, there's tons of archaeological evidence that says a lot of very interesting things and is still actively being suppressed. Um, Nabda Playa is a site in Egypt which was there was a really excellent book put out about 10 years ago about it. Um, and yet nobody knows about it. Why?
Exactly.
Well, why? These are the questions we must ask. But yeah, it's not hard to come up with examples of suppression because they're literally everywhere you look.
Hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And even if it doesn't have to be a big discovery, just if it's an alternative explanation,
Hmm.
an
Yeah,
alternative, well, maybe that's enough sometimes to like squelch it. And I mean, God knows, with as much information as put out, there's also a million ways to go with it of how to squelch it, bury it. Let's
sure,
say in Google
absolutely,
search, you know. See,
absolutely.
go
And
back into the
it's
front page
sometimes
of
we
that search thing, and then you'll find the reference to it.
Yeah,
Yes,
but
I've
there's
seen
a
it.
lot of information that is now available,
Yeah.
if you know where to look. Um, uh, but I mean, it's the same story that has been happening for thousands of years. We see the same thing happening now as we saw. Well, here in Canada, there's a one of the big stories of the last year or two has been um, these. I don't know if you've even heard about this story, but basically, we used to have what we called residential schools, and essentially, what would happen is that they were the children from the native reserves were sent to live in these institutions. Um,
Okay.
many children were killed in the schools. So that's our big thing now is we're now digging up these mass graves and going,
I heard
how
some.
could this be? How could we
Oh, wait,
allow
wait, wait,
this to
wait.
happen?
How far back are we talking here that they did this?
Well, this has been ongoing for the last school was only shut down in 1997,
Okay.
and
So
it
it's pretty
started in
recent.
the mid in the 19 I believe it started in the 1940s or 1945, I think maybe.
So
So
in other words,
basically,
these kids were
war.
being pulled out and they were living at the schools?
Yes. So because here's the thing, and this is nothing new because this is exactly what happened when this is exactly what happened in America to the First
Yes.
Nations there. This is exactly what happened to with the conquistadors in South America, and basically decimated the Inca and whatever was left of any previous civilization in South America, um,
Mhm.
burning buildings, burning books, killing everyone who knew anything, especially priests, especially government officials that were there,
Right.
and like anybody had any kind of cultural knowledge that they would have wanted to pass on orally. All of those shamans, all those guys were the primary target, which was exactly the same thing as what has happened in North America, and because in Canada, we were less successful than south of the border in um, some of our attempts to exterminate and uh, subjugate some of the native communities.
So let me ask you
And
something.
so,
What were they doing? They were pulling these kids out. Let's say, okay, we're sending you to school. You're
yeah.
going to live there. And what's happening now? They're
So,
finding.
well, okay. So post-war, World War II, there was a
Okay.
there was a very um, I don't know if it had anything to do with the effects or like, well, you gotta wonder. You got Nazis doing this stuff to the Jews, and then as soon as the war is over, Canada turns around and starts doing the exact same thing
Hmm.
to not exactly, but a lot of the similar type of tactics
Right.
to the First Nations, because what we're trying to do is assimilate. We make it sound nice. We want to integrate people.
Right.
A lot of these same issues are the same types of issues that have happened with blacks and whites in America and the
Hmm.
whole racial polarity and all that kind of stuff. So these are
Right.
problems that have been happening for thousands of years.
Hmm.
But in recent memory in Canada, became pretty good at, okay, well, we've got to do something because these these Indians, as they were called at the time, are a problem. So what are we going to do about this Indian problem? Well, it's the
Okay.
exact same narrative as the Nazis taking care of the Jew problem.
Right.
So what we came up with in Canada was we're going to hire a bunch of nuns primarily and priests and stuff like that, people
Okay.
who have already basically volunteered to be volunteers for the rest of their life, and
Okay.
they're okay with it.
Yeah.
So okay, we'll get them to do this cool job. Hey, we've got a great job for you. You get to take care of children. So,
Right.
well, who wouldn't want to do that? So,
Right.
so they went into the villages and uh, basically um, they said, well, these native practices are demonic or are, so there's all this extra language being put on
Uh-huh.
because it doesn't fit with what we want them to do. We want
Okay.
them to just be normal people and well, possibly, maybe the intent was we don't want to have to pay for them because Canada, I can't remember what it's like in America, but in Canada, if you have a qualification as being some type of First Nation, like
Hmm.
there's a certain process where you can prove that you're a native, and
Right.
then you get subsidized. So
Oh, here in the
whether
United States, I believe it depends exactly like what you're saying. You have to prove, first of all, your
yeah,
lineage, whatever it is.
right,
But I think it differentiates from tribe to tribe, depending, if they have even the, what you call it, the casinos, whatever it is. But each
yeah,
tribe
yeah, yeah,
is different. But yes, you have to
right.
prove, and then
So
yeah.
so there's all these agreements in place, and some of them might actually have been coming from a sort of a good intent, like in terms of, well, there's different groups of people and different needs and wants. So how do we remedy these and try to make them mesh together? And in some ways, I don't know if some of these sort of agreements have been almost beneficial. I wouldn't say that the entirety of like every way that First Nations people have always been treated was always badly. I'm not saying that,
Mhm.
but um, the end result generally tends to be pretty shitty. So
Okay.
whether the intent was good or not, but in anyways, um, back in 45 or somewhere around there, the idea was, well, if we can get these children and get them into a good Christian school, and we
Hmm.
can teach them, and they can learn English, and they can become productive members of society and good Christians, and everything will be very good. And then, well, I don't know, maybe we can stop paying them. I don't know if that was a factor at all, but
Okay.
it could have been completely spiritually biased or based. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know
So.
it's mostly political. So
Mhm.
really, it comes about control. So we want to control these people, and we don't like what they're doing right now for
Okay.
whatever reason. Partly because they actually had a good ethic sense of environmentalism. Maybe that was the
Mhm.
thing that pissed off the government. I don't know, because the government at the time, don't forget, was really involved in a lot of um, projects like dam building, road building, and
Sure.
railways, and all this stuff, and expansionary. And a lot of the more environmentally minded people saw problems with that, and sometimes were not afraid to speak up about it.
Right.
Um, so, at any rate, whatever the motivations were, these basically the villages were uh, sort of cut off in a way, because what happened was, um, if you're dependent on a public school system for
Right.
your education, as we are almost entirely in Canada, um, then you have to have access to that public school. So
Sure.
what what happened during that period was, in a lot of the villages where there had been public schools, they they shut them down. So
Uh,
the government has all the power, and they can do whatever the hell they want. So
yeah.
if they decide that we're going to do this, all they have to do is, oh well, we have to close the school, and they make it sound very uh, logical, because, well, it costs a lot of money to run a school for 10 kids.
Right.
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's probably not a really efficient way to do it. Um, so they used these kinds of excuses about efficiency and things like that. But essentially, what happened was that these children were all taken away from their families, and taken to these residential schools that were quite far away, far enough
Mhm.
away that they couldn't really make the trip back to see their family, and
Okay.
they probably weren't given any kind of allowance or anything. And
Mhm.
the families had a difficult time traveling to where the children were,
Right.
and once they did get there, they probably weren't very welcome.
I bet.
Um, so, at any rate, the children were essentially forced into a pretty close to a prison-like environment, um, where you're being told what to do all day by a nun. Well, nuns aren't the most fun people to have around, and to be having to tell you what to do. And so this was probably a very strict lifestyle.
Sure.
Um, and on top of that, one of the primary goals of this whole experiment was, we have to beat the native out of these children.
It's a horrible
And
thing.
so it's terrible. So they
It's a
were being forced to comply with the way that we want them to be. And if a child were to speak in their native tongue,
right.
they would be severely beaten or punished otherwise. Um, anyway, the long story short is, uh, thousands of these children died in the schools,
Wow.
and they weren't. Um, so whether it was, I know for sure that part of that was due to mistreatment directly, to abuse, mistreatment, that kind of thing, beatings. For sure, that was part of it. But I think that part of it was also due to more natural causes, you could say, such as disease, or things like that,
Yeah.
or even fighting between the children. But even when it wasn't directly the fault of the administrators, the way they handled it was extremely evil. They would never tell the parents that their child had died. It's
Wow.
just that your child got taken off to school and you never saw them again.
That's horrible.
And
You
this
can
was
understand there can be nothing
such
as
a huge
traumatic
thing.
for a child to be removed from their family. That's one of the most
Hmm.
traumatic things you could do to a child. Let's
Yeah,
start with that.
yeah.
As far as
So
mental well-being and everything, that's like
absolutely. And so there are a lot of in the town where I live, the population is approximately between 11 and 14. I haven't checked recently, but percent of native population. So there's a lot of native people around.
Mhm.
And a lot of them come to my city because it's sort of a hub, and
Right.
they've maybe grown up in a small village somewhere, where thankfully that kind of direct oppression is not happening very much, but there's still a
Right.
lot of racism. Um, and the opportunities out in these little villages is very slim. So a lot of people end up coming here to the big city, and
Mhm.
what they find is that it's not necessarily all that it's cracked up to be in terms of opportunity.
Sure.
And so many of the First Nations people that I know have either, I know a few people who lived through the schools and survived to tell the tale, but are severely traumatized. And but most of the people I know who are attached to it did not survive, and their connection is that their cousin or a brother or somebody went there, and thankfully they didn't have to go for whatever reason.
Right.
But it's all too common a tale, and this is exactly the same kind of mistreatment that
So let me
and
ask you
again
something.
suppression.
What's
Yeah,
happening? They're excavating in these areas and they're finding these mass graves, or how does it come to light? Is that now like,
yeah. I don't know exactly how it started, but a few years ago,
uh-huh,
there was somebody dug up some bones, and
okay,
I'm I'm guessing that they didn't know that that grave was there.
right.
Um, but once they found them, and once they realized there was like 100 kids in here, in a big hole, and once they began to realize that this kind of stuff was happening at that one school, they started
And they
checking at
started
other
looking at other
schools.
schools. Okay.
Yeah, so now the death toll is over 1,000 by easily, at this point.
Oh my God. Yeah, and this is the thing, for
Yeah,
example, here, like, in the state of Florida, which is where I'm at, and it's they required a certificate, a death certificate, like from 1917 on. All right.
mhm,
Supposedly, you had to certify like the death somehow under whatever the circumstances were.
right,
But that's when you're talking like, I mean, I've looked at what they reform schools, which of course they would put in their kids that needed reforming, and just about any poor child that even as young as 5. Let's face
yeah,
it, if they were away from their family, sometimes they could say, hey, the kid ran away, especially if it was like a in reality the child was dead, but there would be no how can I say, no pressure to produce a death certificate. You see what
right.
I'm saying? Even
Yeah,
if they could
exactly, and
tell the
so
child was dead.
even though, like, this may be better documented in Canada, I have, I'm absolutely, like, I'm sure that the same type of thing was happening, really everywhere, because honestly, it's the exact same type of stuff that people always do to other people. They never stop doing it. So the fact that we're actually looking at it right now in a specific example,
Mhm.
um, is, well, it honestly doesn't really give me any hope, because we're just going to keep doing the same shit that we always do. But it
No,
is interesting.
no, you know what I'm gonna say? I mean, if you look, especially you that you're a historian,
Hmm.
the value of human life, I think, despite what we see, th- there's more recognition of the value of one human life. I think historically, when you look at it, the value of human life was a lot less, a lot less. It wasn't,
Yeah,
and it was like, it wasn't thought of. It was more of a dog eat dog world. You did whatever you need to survive. Whether now because we're more modern times, I'm not going to say horrible things happen, but I think the value of
yeah,
human life is more elevated now. By the way, I'm not saying horrible things like that happen. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that has never even come to light, and God knows if it ever will. But now
yeah.
there's more recognition of, okay, um, no, that can't happen. That can't happen. I don't know. I guess
Yeah,
I'm a
no,
humanist.
yeah,
I'm
you
more
might be right.
optimistic about people, about
Yeah,
mankind.
sure.
I am.
That's
I
good. You know what? If there's anything, I would really hope that I'm wrong. I am not
Yes.
one of the academics who doesn't ever want to be wrong, and I really hope I am wrong on this. But you know, getting back to the whole topic of, like, this suppression stuff, because
Mhm.
really, aside from the human life aspect of it, there's also this there's the death of culture, and
Yes.
what we're like that was really the stated intent of this Canadian experiment, if
Of
you
course.
will, or whatever it
Hmm.
was really the government said in their documentation at the start off of this project that was their stated intent, was to beat the Indian out of the Indians, and it worked so well that South Africa sent government representations to Canada to learn how we did it, so that they could take that back and implement their apartheid situation
Wow.
in the 80s. So the apartheid in South Africa was directly engineered based
I did
on
not
the
know that.
Canadian data
I
and
have no idea.
status. Yeah,
Let me tell you,
it's crazy.
I can imagine that probably some well, after they caught on, I imagine some of these in these villages, they would like hide their kids. Hey, we're gonna send your kids. No, I don't have any. Take them out to the
Absolutely,
woods,
yes.
hide them. I
Yep,
wouldn't let my
for
kid like
sure.
forget it. I'd rather he'd be illiterate, thanks, but he's alive. But
Yep,
I can
that's
imagine
absolutely
desperate
true.
people will get desperate to keep their children safe. People will do anything.
Yeah, for
As a
sure.
matter of fact, I think that a lot of what you see nowadays with a lot of people like is because in some instances people are seeing their children being affected or that there's a manipulation as far as taking children away from parental and it's like no no no. I think a lot of people that don't care about other things this is the point where they jump on board and go no no leave my kid out of it man
Right.
you
Yep,
know
absolutely. And this
that
kind of stuff really messes up not only the people involved, but generations afterwards.
sure of
And so
course
right now, while we have right now, I'm assuming that this is a thing in America as well as Canada. There
hmm
is a what they're calling the opioid crisis,
sure
where just
absolutely
so many overdoses, and well,
hmm
it's directly because of this mistreatment and bullying and harassment and everything else that's been happening for hundreds of years.
right
Even yeah, obviously before the residential schools, they're just the last thing.
right
But when people are traumatized,
yes
they have no choice but to try desperate measures, and this traumatization is directly due to this attempt to annihilate the culture. And so this is where it ties back directly with the archaeological side of things,
hmm
because these attempts at annihilating the culture have been in play for thousands of years. In China, there was at the beginning of the sometime around 300 AD, there was a regime change where a new
hmm
king came in, and he had radically different ideas from the previous guy. His first act was to burn the universities down, burn the books, and kill every single professor in the country. This is internally his own country. We see the same kind of thing happening with the well, of course, we mentioned the conquistadors already. Egypt was also a target back in the first century AD when the Library of Alexandria was burned,
burned yes
and I can guarantee you that the Library of Alexandria had a lot of information about the Atlantean civilization, and
sure
this is not wild speculation. This is exactly what Plato and Solon were telling us, because Solon had been to that library before it
right
burnt down,
right
and he read those books, and this is why he was able to pass this along. So the information that we're getting from Plato came through Solon, but also came through Dendera, like I already talked about, but also through the Library of Alexandria. So just because the library
right
burnt down and they tried to make us forget about this information, well, it didn't work because one man managed to keep the story alive. It's the
sure
same kind of thing that's happening in on the biblical end of things, because when various committees that were set up by the Pope decided this is the book we're allowed to read and this one we're not.
Right.
And they basically did that whole thing. Well, there's always somebody who goes, hell no, you're not banning this book. I'm going to go hide it. Like you say, you hide
Yes.
your children. Yes. And because children are important. Also,
Yes.
what's important is knowledge, and especially that cultural knowledge. And so thank God that there have been people all throughout history who
Right.
have seen fit and wise enough to hide and squirrel away
Well,
various
this
pieces
is
of
the thing
information.
and that's what I'm hopeful for. That before the only repository of all this information would say, let's say, this one spot. In that case, it was the Library of Alexandria. Hopefully now,
Mhm.
the way things are with technology, which is like the upside of it, which is information, is a lot of people have that information. Now it's very difficult to stamp it out because there's somebody that's somewhere downloaded a hard copy and a thumb drive somewhere of that, whatever it is. So to
Yeah,
suppress information now is not quite as easy, or how can I say, all encompassing as before. Now it's
right.
much
So
more difficult.
that's why misinformation and disinformation have become the key.
Yes, yes,
So
yes. Like what what's
enter your congressman. And what's he saying? He's absolutely straight up lying to you, because the fact that he is saying this stuff has never happened is
right,
100%
right.
false and
And
easily
you know
proven.
what? I hate to say it, and you made a good point where you said at the very beginning, I started to research what I had read. In
Mhm.
other words, that's something what we all need to do and not take everything at face value and assume they could be lying about this. Yeah,
Right.
unfortunately, that's not the way
Well,
you.
yeah, and that's the problem, is everybody's lying about everything until they decide, holy shit, I've been lying about stuff. Do I want to
Yeah,
continue doing that or not?
yeah.
Because I can guarantee that everybody is lying about something because they don't know that it's a lie. Now,
Well,
of
yeah,
course, there's also the intentional lies as well. That's
yeah,
another thing. But every single person I have ever met has told me something that wasn't true, but they believed it was true.
right.
Okay, and
Well,
there's
there's a difference.
good
There's a
reason
difference.
for that. Right, and there's a major difference. But I don't know if you remember that TV show House with
Yes.
Dr. Gregory House, and his famous quote was, "Everybody lies." Now they weren't always lying on purpose, but
Hmm.
they lied, and
Right.
they misinformed his diagnosis so many times, and often it cost them their life. And I believe that that is truly the state that we all find ourselves in, uh, partly because primarily due to unquestioning belief in whatever somebody in power told us. And that guy is also under the same misinformed belief because of somebody who told him a thing. And so this is the fascinating thing for me in the work that I'm doing now, is that why hasn't anyone ever noticed this stuff? It's like very obvious, actually, right? So a lot of this stuff, and but it's because we are we're taught to read at a shallow level. We're
Yes.
taught to believe what we're told. We're
Yes.
not taught to ask questions. We're not taught to dig into what we have right in front of us. But
Mhm.
this is the answer. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Well, no, it's not. And it doesn't make sense. The answers
You
that
know
we've
why?
been
Because
told.
everybody's too busy watching TikTok videos. I'm only kidding, but I'm not. What is it? A 10
But
second.
I
That's what
mean,
it is. It's a 10-second video.
well, it is. But even I mean, it's impossible for everyone to dig into every
No, I
field.
understand. I
Um,
understand.
but I think it is very important to pick that field that really catches your heart and your soul, and get into it, and don't just believe what everybody's telling you. Because I've noticed I'm not a biologist. I've hardly studied any biology, nothing in school. I was focused on the physics and the math and the computer stuff. But even with my limited, I am a scientist, so I get how things work. I am an engineer, I get how things work. So even with very basic information, about biology because I will, I'm pretty well read. Um, I've noticed some things that just don't add up in terms of uh, the mitochondria is one really good example. What they teach you about the mitochondria is true, but not really. And the same thing goes for everything at the cellular level about how biology works is very much slanted. Um, Not even so much in terms of misinformation on that, but just in terms of suppression. Because any biologist who knows truly how this works will notice very readily, because it's quite apparent, even to somebody like me, that the concept of a species and the
Mm-hmm.
concept of a an organism is fundamentally flawed, and yet we're not throwing it away because it's too complicated to think about it the other way. Well, I'm a human. I know that. That's I can do something with that. Okay, but actually, I'm a collection of a whole bunch of like other collections of a whole bunch of other sentient beings that make up my cells. How do I deal with that? That's I don't have a framework for that, but that seems to be the truth.
Well, I think that partly what you're saying is that despite whatever you read, that you have to keep an open mind, as in, I can believe this up to a certain point,
Mhm.
but be always open to say, I'm going to leave that door open if something makes sense, of course, that maybe even contradicts this or not,
Yeah,
or not.
yeah, exactly.
People,
And to me, a big thing is putting different ideas together. So if we have any biology majors watching, take the concept of the mitochondria and of symbiosis, dig into it. You're going to be like, there's shit in there that will blow your mind. But I can't tell it to you because I don't understand it enough. But
okay.
I understand it enough just to see that there's something weird going on. Spirituality, the same types of things. There's weird stuff that that are partly um, acknowledged in the
Hmm.
traditional spiritual channels, whether that be Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, New Age, or whatever other kind of spirituality you're into. There's all the stuff that's the standard thing. And then there's this, okay, but what if I also add, um, take a snippet from another field? How does that mash together? These are where the real revelations are, because all the stuff that we know that's being said is there's a lot of good information, but it's all there. Really, the trick is that they all have boundaries drawn around them, and those boundaries seem to be now. I'm not really into gigantic conspiracy theories, but it
Hmm.
almost seems like somebody has specifically and willingly drew lines around all possible subjects, stuffed them into little boxes, and made it so that it's difficult for those to touch. The
Yeah,
whole church and state and never the twain shall meet, and
right.
we have that in every field. So the same
Right.
is
If you
true
go there,
if
you're like,
you
oh, you're a crackpot. You're going there? No. Yes.
right, exactly,
There's
exactly.
a stigma attached
But
to
this
exploring certain subjects or certain theories, if you want to call them that.
Yes. So here's the thing: if there was such a massive, like global scale of suppression, well, we've already established that suppression is occurring absolutely all time, all around. But at what scale? Is it possible that there is a global conspiracy that is designed to keep us from knowing everything? Well, I don't think so. But let me say this: if that was the case, who has the knowledge and the technology to pull that off? It's beyond human capability. So when you asked
That's an
earlier
interesting
if
concept.
the ETs are here, what do they want? Well, we know they're here. We see them all the time. You just got to ask the right people, and those people are scared. and they aren't necessarily going to tell you. I've interviewed a few people who I'm the only person they've ever told their story to, because there still is a stigma. There still is that, even though it's a lot more open, it's not open enough. And
Mhm.
yet, and things are weird too. And there's weird shit going on. And well, people will think I'm weird. Yeah, they will, because life is weird. But that's the thing. We got to be okay with that. And so maybe that is the point of what the ETs want. Maybe they want to see if we'll ever figure out their scheme and see behind the curtain. I don't know. That we already know that it's basically an experiment, because that's the why else would they be DNA manipulating the DNA?
Sure.
It's some kind of experiment. Uh, they're not here to mine gold. Um, I mean, not saying that they didn't ever mine gold, but that's not why they're here, because they're not extracting gold right now. Um, but they are maybe possibly still extracting data from their long-lasting experiment. But they're not here to wipe us out, despite what your congressman is telling you. They are not a threat. We are, in fact, their children. So, if anything, they are inclined to protect us rather than to hurt us. Um, and other than that, we can only speculate.
Sure, of course, and that is the thing right there that I think ultimately we come to a crossroads at, which is if they're here, which most people at some point believe that, is what do they want? Okay,
Yeah,
is it is it good for us, or are we going to find ourselves on the short end of the stick? And I think that's the one.
right.
I think most people, it's not just the question. Well, I could take it if I knew they were here to for us or to help us or liked us. It's the
Yeah.
alternative that
Well,
worries a lot.
so and I think that's a really excellent point. Is that some in the Christian world, some of my friends like to point out you got to look at the fruit, which essentially means um, I won't go into the whole explanation behind it, but basically, a good tree bears good fruit. If you think that you've got an apple tree in your yard, wait till fall. Is there an
Mhm.
apple on it? Okay, then you know it's an apple tree. Um, and so, really, I think that's what it comes down to, is that if you look at the fruit of the various entities that are around and that are already observing us, so the extraterrestrials, if they exist, and if they are in fact here observing us, um, what is the fruit of that? Well, they haven't killed us. They aren't attacking us. They aren't terrorizing us. They aren't causing us to live in fear. Now look at some of the other entities around, that are definitely around that we know of. For example, Washington D.C. and all that that entails and contains. We know that they're here. We know that they're watching us. They're even watching me, even though I'm outside of your borders. We know that, and they are trying to terrorize us. They are actively pursuing um, projects that are extremely detrimental to our health and safety, and possibly to our extended life on this planet.
Mhm.
They are actively harming the planet. They're actively harming their own citizens, as well as citizens abroad and other enemies within.
Right.
Um, I mean, that's not controversial. Uh, they are the Food and Drug Administration is the biggest poisoner of
Yeah.
any life ever that ever inhabited any planet. I would estimate.
But
Um,
you know what kind
the
of a lot
fact
of
that
people
Coca
alerted
Cola
recently is
is
that the FDA, and they would think, "Oh no, the FDA said it's okay." Until very
yeah,
recently,
exactly.
most people assumed, and I'm not going to say because I'm one of those. Yeah, no, it's FDA. The FDA tested it. The FDA said it was okay, so it's got to be okay. And I think a lot of people are having like this, huh? What? which is a
Yeah.
tough thing because it complicates your world, whatever your world is. When I mean that first person, this is, what your perception
Yeah.
is, that's reality kind of deal, where it
Yeah.
complicates things to the nth degree, because if this is, then what else is untrustworthy? I mean, it's like, believe it or not, human beings are
Absolutely.
creatures of habit, and we like, the
Right.
horizon becomes very fuzzy when we start doing stuff like that, and humans start going,
Right.
"Oh my god."
Yeah, absolutely. So you got to ask yourself, what is the fruit? Why is the FDA actively trying to kill every citizen in America by
Wow.
poisoning every crop that is
Oh,
grown in America? By poisoning you directly with the pollutants of heavy metals and other bullshit products that are put in fertilizer and that are required by law to be applied to every crop in it grown in America. Why is that?
exactly.
So look at the fruit. Who's trying to kill you? It's not the ETs, unless the ETs have already infiltrated your government. That's I
Oh my
mean, that's
God,
the only
Ken.
way to blame the.
Okay, okay. I mean, this that rabbit hole's too deep. Hold on, wait. Let me tell you something. And I
That's the
know I
only
hate
way
to
to
say it,
infiltrate
but it's
the.
one of those that you look down and you're like, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there because this is ugly, ugly, ugly. But I'm sure there's a lot of people going, I knew it. I knew it. It's ETs. That's who's really running the show. And they're like, but I hate to say
I
it
have
because a
I
lot of
have
people,
no evidence for that.
I
I have
know that.
no
I know
evidence
that.
for
I
that.
know that.
But
I
what
know.
I do
And
see is I see evil people doing very evil
yes.
things to you every day and to me, even though I
Now,
live in a
by
different
extension,
country. All of my food comes from California.
yeah.
So I am being slowly poisoned by
Yeah,
Washington, D.C., as
everybody.
surely as you are.
I think a lot of people, like I said, it was a safer idea to believe that your government and all these agencies, by extension, would be there to help and protect you. And everybody's had a very rude awakening, realizing in the last few years things have been coming out. Um, toxicity, things of things like that. That people are like, okay, I can't ignore this. But then it
Hmm.
becomes like, okay, how do I exist in this modern world while, unless I move off, what they say, off the grid is like, but I don't want to live like that,
Yeah,
so it becomes very difficult sometimes to make these choices, and it complicates life a lot because, like I said, technology is great, but at the same time it's complicated our lives in a million other ways as well. All right.
yeah, for sure.
And it
Absolutely.
depends. Well, anyway, Ken, I want to thank you so. It's been so fascinating talking to you because it's like, man, this show could go on for hours and hours. But it's been great
Yeah, for sure.
for my podcast listeners. What's your website and where they can find your books?
Yeah, so my books are all on Amazon, as well as my website is dimensionfold.com.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to check that out, there's actually it's basically my publishing company. So there's myself and some other authors are on there.
Okay.
But it's easy to find my stuff. I've got a link right on the main page.
Okay.
Um, and I also have a YouTube channel,
Okay.
which is a little bit more difficult to find. So just go to dimensionfold.com and there's a
All
link
right.
there
And there's
to
a
my
link they can
YouTube as
jump from
well.
there. Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Again, thank you so much, Ken. It has been wonderful to talk to you. And do you have any books in the works? Are you thinking of
Yeah, I
or
sure
doing?
do. So I'm working on a really monumental project that could go a couple of different ways. So I can't say exactly what the book is about,
Mm-hmm.
but really one of the things that I'm looking at right now is um, some of the stuff I've got is really tying together the Sumerian texts, some of the interesting things that I've uncovered in the Sumerian texts, and then tying that into some of the biblical texts.
Okay.
And But this time I'm gonna kind of expand my horizon a little bit, and because in my UFOs in the Bible book, I really put a strict boundary on myself that I would only talk about stuff that's in the canonical Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of material that I didn't cover that I'm going to start to delve into a little bit more. So things like the Book of Enoch and some of the other non-canonical stories, and And it's interesting, even the books that are included in the Bible. I'm specifically looking at the book of Daniel here, which is in the Bible, except for chapter 14, which has been cut out. And so, why is that? And so, there's a
Okay.
lot of very interesting material that has been uh, expunged, but not entirely, because the remnant has remained. And there's some very interesting stuff in there. But even more interesting, I find, and what I'm kind of focusing on because no one else is. A lot of people talk about the Book of Enoch. Nobody has ever noticed the things that I'm getting out of the Book of Job right now. Some very fascinating information
Okay.
that ties directly to the Enuma Elish, as well as some of the stories from Enoch and the Nephilim and these types of topics. So whatever the next book that I come out with, it's going to be very fascinating, but I can't tell you
Okay.
exactly what it's about or what the
I
title will be.
understand. I understand. Again, it has been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. And I want to wish you the best of
Thank
luck
you.
on everything you do, okay?
Thank you. It's been great.
Likewise, take care. Bye-bye. Wow. Yes, sir, Bob. Talk about. See? And let me tell you something. I agree with him. There's a lot of stuff that how can I say it? That a lot of these ancient texts, either because it was difficult to access them or time consuming, or the people that would normally do it, let's say academics, let's say in a university, it's almost like the word got out. Like, if you're going to go and do this research and you're going to come up with a different conclusion or different theory than what's out there, that it's going to get shut down by the powers that be. So a lot of these professors or academics that like their tenure or want to be like, hey, you know what? I'm not going to rock that. I know that theory or that teaching or that whatever it is, that's not exactly right. But you know what? I'm not going to go there. And again, a lot of these, whether it's anthropological work, research of any type, these things have to be funded. The ones that fund them are the universities. Sometimes, you'll have the government help out, but or private donor will fund something. But in other words, this is how these things run. This is the money that's needed for whatever it is. It's got to be funded by somebody. Okay. And in some cases, that situation's like you don't bite the hand that feeds you kind of deal. All right. So that's why I'm saying that even if you had somebody, whether they were planning the attempt or actually found something, a lot of times that story or that theory or that discovery was kept under wraps because the university or whoever was sponsoring it just did not want to go with that narrative. And I mean, and I don't want to say paranoid because this is not everything. This is not everything. But this inviolability, this version was given out by the University of blah 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 blah, which of course is probably a top tier university. Is like, they would never lie about this theory or this discovery or this whatever. Like he says, even though we just found a fingernail and now we've just constructed this new whatever human hominid dinosaur whatever and then blah 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 blah. Who's going to go against that? Most people don't know any better to go to dispute it. And the people that might have the access is like, we'll think twice about it. Like, what am I going to do this to prove what? All right. Same thing. I mentioned it. Piltdown Man for a while. Oh, it was like a big thing. It turns out that it was a made up. They had put like, I think, a mandible of a baboon on a skull, and it was made up, with this thing of the missing link and all this thing, evolution and let's say the typical layperson, let's say when that came out, who was going to gainsay and go, no, that's not accurate. Nobody knew. First of all, nobody was up to actually handling this this fossil or whatever to say, hey, you know what, that, or know that, have the knowledge to say, you know what, that jaw does not belong on that skull, because that's maybe a human skull, but that mandible is an animal. That like, or number one, who would have access to it? And if you had access to it, would you have the knowledge to differentiate? Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? And then when they put this out, all these academics, everybody took it as gospel. Turns out it was a big hoax. All right. Same thing now with a lot of the things that they're like what we were discovering, that before they were saying that a lot of like the Neanderthals and all these never crossbred with modern humans. When I say modern humans, as in us, turns out we did. In other words, there was a lot of other species of humans. Okay, not hominids, not ape-like, none of that. Humans that interbred. So they say that when they say, well, a lot of these went extinct, they really didn't go extinct per se, because a lot of them interbred. Like he's 4% Neanderthal, I'm 3% Neanderthal. Okay. And I'm thinking maybe there's even other ones that they don't know how to test for, but now they're realizing that there was like a diaspora of different types of humans that interbred with one another. Okay. Basically to produce us, modern humans, what you see now. All right. It wasn't like this side by side, these parallel existence. Okay. What happened was these different humans interbred, and eventually, like everything else, how can I say? You get the hardiest, that's, you know, the whatever, what, you know, the ones that can adapt the best to the climate, to whatever it is that they're at, the ones that maybe can overcome maybe certain diseases because they build up immunities, and then, you know, little by little you get what we have now. You see what I'm saying? So again, I'm glad in a way that things are being questioned. Not everything should be questioned in the sense that not everything is false. But I do agree with Ken that there's a lot of that's put out there as the history of us, the world, of everything that is not exactly accurate. Okay. Including religious texts, you know, the Bible. Even, you know, whether it's the Old Testament, the New Testaments, other things, there's a lot of things that, and I agree with him, it always boils down to power over control the masses, or what they believe. Okay. Which is a horrible thing to think of, because usually stuff like that usually ends up bad for the individual, not the group, but the individuals. But I think it's very interesting. And also what he was talking about when he says this thing about the ETs, you know, have they been around? And if they've been around, are they the same ones? Maybe we had ones that were around for ancient civilizations, hung out and split. They're gone. Now the new ones have come up. Hey, did you hear about this place called Earth? We're going to stop by there. Yeah, we don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe they didn't. Again, what are their intentions? Are they just observing us? Are they crossbreeding with us? Are they taking our genetic material? Or are they just cutting up cows? Like, how many cows do you need to cut up for what? You see what I'm saying? Is there more than one? And I know a lot of people makes them feel very uncomfortable, because it's like, are we lab rats? Because we like to remember, we always think of ourselves as king of the hill. You know, if anybody's going to be a lab rat, it's the rat, not us. All right. But I do agree with him on one thing, which is that it worries me why all of a sudden there's just this fixation from the higher up the food chains of making a big deal of UFOs and extraterrestrials. And when everybody's been talking about us, like us, as in the regular people, have been shooting videos, snapping photos, telling stories to who would listen. In some cases, some people never ever said anything. Now all of a sudden, and it's like a big deal. And I've even heard of now people coming forward from the government that I was an abductee. Come on. Who are you kidding? Who are you kidding? You guys are trying to convince us all that all these sightings of lights were like weather balloons or whatever, or you were all mistaken. How'd that happen? In other words, I don't know. I'm very suspicious when it comes to that. Why now? And I hate to think that they're going to go down the road of making them hostile towards us. Because I do agree with Ken. If they've been around, maybe the worst of their hostility is cutting up cows. I don't know. versus, them making it just really wigging us out totally beyond the most that we've been wigged out anyway to begin with, by telling us that now we have to worry about ETs that are going to do what? Who knows? I don't know. I'm still out on that one. As to why the sudden interest, and like I said, that you've even got an elected official making, what's the word I'm looking for? That they got to control misinformation about UFOs. Come on. That comes with the territory. People have been talking and saying stories about UFOs. Some of them are accurate and truthful. Some of them are like lies, and some of them are people maybe that, the bolts aren't screwed on too tight, whatever. That comes with the mix, like in all things. But usually the government has left that alone, you think? I don't know. There's more to it than that. But anyway, guys, thank you again for being part of my audience. You are wonderful. Please come back. I have a lot of great guests scheduled to come on. Again, don't forget, go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com for links to everything that we talk about. And please come back next week. And I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.